At 44, my brother leaned back in his chair at Thanksgiving and said selling insurance was what people did when they ran out of options. The table laughed. Even my son looked down at his plate, and I remember nodding like it was a joke I was in on. But I wasn't, because 2 weeks before that dinner I had been laid off after 18 years at the same company, and no one at that table knew that my checking account had just over $2,000 left, or that I had already missed one mortgage payment and was staring at the second one coming due, or that every morning I sat in my truck outside a coffee shop pretending to check emails while I refreshed job listings that never called back. I had spent my entire adult life doing things the right way. Showing up early, staying late, raising 2 kids, paying bills on time, believing that loyalty would protect me, and in less than 90 days that belief was gone, replaced by a quiet kind of panic that doesn't make noise, but follows you everywhere, into the grocery store, into your sleep, into conversations where you pretend everything is fine. I didn't tell my wife the full number in the bank. I rounded it up in my head like that would somehow stretch it further. I told myself it was temporary, that I would find something stable, something respectable, something that made sense to people like my brother who measured success by job titles and steady paychecks. But after 11 applications and 0 interviews, I stopped using the word temporary. And that was around the time an old coworker called and asked if I had ever thought about getting into insurance. I almost laughed when he said it. Not because it was funny, but because it sounded like exactly the kind of thing people say when they don't have better options. Commission-based, unpredictable, something you hear about in passing, but never imagine for yourself. I told him I would think about it. And that night I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone went to bed, staring at numbers that didn't work anymore. Bills that used to be routine now felt like deadlines I couldn't meet, and for the first time in my life I wasn't choosing between good and better. I was choosing between uncertain and impossible. The next morning I signed up for the licensing course. I didn't tell anyone right away, not my brother, not even my kids, because I already knew what they would say, that it wasn't a real career, that it was risky, that at my age starting over like that didn't make sense, and maybe they were right, but what I didn't say out loud was that doing nothing made even less sense. So I drove across town to a small office with peeling paint and a handwritten sign on the door, and I sat in a folding chair with a notebook like I was 20 again. Except I wasn't. I was a middle-aged man trying to rebuild something he didn't know how to name yet, and as the instructor talked about policies and premiums and commissions, I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be fast, and it definitely wasn't going to impress anyone at a dinner table, but it was a way forward, and at that point forward was the only direction I had left. So when people said it was a dead-end job, I didn't argue. I didn't try to convince them. I just kept showing up, because deep down I knew something they didn't. I wasn't trying to prove them wrong. I was trying to survive long enough to become someone they wouldn't recognize anymore. I remember the first 90 days more clearly than anything that came after, because that was the part no one ever talks about when they say things like try something new or take a risk at your age. Those 90 days were not inspiring or exciting. They were quiet and uncomfortable and filled with moments that made me question every decision I had made. I woke up every morning at 6 like I still had a real job to go to. I put on a collared shirt even when I did not have a single appointment scheduled, and I sat at the small desk in our spare bedroom staring at a list of phone numbers that felt longer than it actually was. The training manual said to make at least 100 calls a day. I did not even know 100 people who would pick up the phone, so I started dialing strangers, small business owners, contractors, people who had their numbers listed online, and most of the time the call did not even last 10 seconds. They would hang up before I could finish introducing myself. Sometimes they would not say anything at all, just silence, and then the click, and after about 20 calls my voice would start to sound different, less confident, more careful. Like I was already expecting the next rejection before it happened. I kept a notebook next to me, and I wrote down every no as if it meant something, as if tracking the rejection would somehow make it easier to carry. By the end of the first week, I had pages filled with names and numbers and outcomes that all looked the same. No answer, not interested, call back never. I drove across the city more than I ever had before. Phoenix felt bigger when you were not sure where you were going. I would park outside strip malls and walk into small offices with a folder in my hand pretending I belonged there, introducing myself to people who did not ask to meet me. Some were polite, most were not. A few looked at me like I was wasting their time. And maybe I was. Because I still did not fully understand what I was offering. I just knew I needed to keep going. Lunch became whatever I could eat in the car, usually a sandwich from a gas station or something I packed from home. I stopped checking my bank account every day because the number did not change in the direction I needed it to, and I started calculating time instead of money. How many weeks before the next payment was due? How many days before I had to explain to my wife that this might not work? At night, I would sit at the dinner table and listen more than I talked. My kids would tell stories about school. My wife would ask how the day went, and I would say it was fine because I did not have another word ready. Fine became my default answer because it was easier than explaining something I did not yet understand myself. There were moments when I thought about quitting, not dramatically, not all at once, just small thoughts that showed up when I was tired or when another call ended before it began. Thoughts like maybe my brother was right, maybe this was exactly what it looked like from the outside, a last option, something you do when everything else has already failed. But then there were other moments too. Quieter ones. Like when someone stayed on the phone for a full minute, or when a business owner asked a real question instead of brushing me off. Those moments did not pay anything. They did not solve my immediate problems, but they felt like small openings, and I started to realize that this was not going to change overnight. It was going to change one conversation at a time, if it changed at all. So I kept showing up the next morning and the morning after that, not because I was confident, but because stopping would have meant going back to a place I had already outgrown. Even if I did not know it yet, I still remember the first time someone did not hang up on me. It was a Tuesday afternoon and the sun felt heavier than usual through the windshield. I had already made close to 80 calls that day, and most of them ended before I could even say my name. My voice had started to sound mechanical, like I was reading from a script I did not believe in. And I was about to stop for the day when a man picked up and said hello without rushing me. His name was Carlos. He owned a small trucking company with 3 drivers and one old office near the highway. I told him I worked with families and small business owners to help them protect what they had built. I expected the usual response, not interested, maybe later, but instead he asked a question, a real one. He said, "What exactly does that mean for someone like me?" And for a second, I did not have a polished answer ready. I just told him the truth. I said it means if something happens to you, your family does not have to figure everything out on their own. It means your business does not disappear overnight. There was a pause on the line, not the kind that ends the call, but the kind that makes you realize someone is actually thinking about what you said. He told me to stop by his office the next day. I wrote down the address twice to make sure I would not forget. That night at dinner, I almost said something different when my wife asked how my day went. I almost told her about the appointment, but I held back, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I did not want to turn it into something bigger than it was. Not yet. The next morning I got there early, parked across the street, and sat in the truck longer than I needed to, going over what I might say, trying to sound like someone who belonged in that room. When I walked in, the office smelled like coffee and paper and something familiar about long hours. Carlos shook my hand and sat me down without rushing. We talked for almost 40 minutes, not about policies or numbers at first, but about his business, his drivers, how he started with one truck and built everything slowly. And somewhere in that conversation, I stopped trying to sell and started trying to understand. He told me about a friend who had passed away a year earlier, left behind a wife and 2 kids and a business that collapsed within months because no one knew how to keep it running. He said he did not want that to happen to his family. That was the moment everything shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet realization that this was not about convincing someone to buy something they did not need. It was about helping them prepare for something they hoped would never happen. I walked him through a basic plan, simple, nothing complicated. And when he agreed to move forward, I felt something I had not felt in months. Not relief exactly, but direction. Like I finally understood what I was supposed to be doing. The commission on that first policy was not life-changing, it did Not fix my bank account overnight, but it proved something more important, that this could work if I did it the right way. When I got back in my truck, I sat there for a minute and looked at the steering wheel like it was different somehow. Like the same drive home would not feel the same anymore. That evening when my wife asked about my day, I said it was better than fine. And for the first time in a long time, I meant it. Not because everything was solved, but because something had finally started. After that first sale, things did not suddenly become easy, but they became clearer, and clarity changed the way I showed up every day. I stopped trying to sound like a salesperson and started sounding like someone who had something worth explaining. I rewrote my script 3 times in 1 week, not because anyone told me to, but because I realized the words mattered more than the product itself. People did not respond to numbers or charts. They responded to stories that felt close to their own lives. So instead of talking about coverage amounts and policy terms, I started asking questions, simple ones, like what happens to your business if you cannot show up tomorrow? What happens to your family if your income stops for even a few months? Those conversations felt different, slower, more real, and even when people said no, they stayed on the line longer. They listened, and that alone felt like progress. I began to notice patterns in who would actually engage with me: small business owners, people who had built something with their own hands, truck drivers, contractors, people who understood risk because they lived with it every day. I stopped wasting time trying to convince people who were not ready and focused on the ones who were already thinking about the future, but did not know how to prepare for it. That shift saved me hours every week, and slowly it started to show in my numbers. The second month, I made enough to cover groceries and part of the electric bill. It was not impressive to anyone else, but it meant something in our house. I remember my wife looking at me differently when I handed her that check. Not like everything was fixed, but like maybe this path was not as uncertain as it seemed before. I still had days where nothing worked, where calls went nowhere and meetings fell through, but those days no longer felt like proof that I was failing. They felt like part of a process I was beginning to understand. I started keeping track of conversations instead of rejections, writing down what people cared about, what questions made them pause, what stories made them open up. Over time, those notes became more valuable than any training material I had been given. They taught me how to listen. And listening turned out to be the one skill that changed everything. By the 3rd month, I was driving less and meeting more people through referrals. Carlos had introduced me to 2 other business owners, and those introductions led to more conversations that felt natural instead of forced. I was no longer knocking on doors hoping someone would tolerate me for a few minutes. I was walking into rooms where people already knew my name, even if just a little. That difference changed my confidence in a way I could not fake before. I still wore the same shirts and drove the same truck. Nothing about my outside life had changed yet, but inside something was settling into place. Like I was no longer chasing something random, but building something intentional. One conversation at a time, and for the first time since I lost my job, I stopped thinking about what I had lost and started paying attention to what I was slowly creating. It was not fast, it was not dramatic, but it was real, and that was enough to keep me moving forward. I did not notice the shift all at once. It happened quietly over weeks that started to feel different from the ones before. The calls were no longer cold in the same way. The conversations did not feel like interruptions anymore. They felt like continuations of something that had already begun. People would say, "I heard about you from Carlos," or someone mentioned you helped them figure things out, and every time I heard that, it felt like a small confirmation that I was no longer invisible in this work. The 4th month was the first time I sat down and added everything up without bracing myself for disappointment. The number was not huge, but it was steady, enough to cover the mortgage payment without moving money around or delaying something else. I paid it online that night and stared at the confirmation screen longer than I needed to, not because it was impressive, but because it felt like a line had been crossed, like I was no longer surviving week to week, but starting to stabilize. My wife noticed the change before I said anything. Not in what I told her, but in how I moved through the house, less distracted, more present, like I was not carrying the same weight into every room. We started talking again about normal things, plans for the kids, small repairs around the house. Things we had quietly put on hold when everything felt uncertain. I still worked the same hours, still woke up early and drove across the city, but the urgency had shifted from panic to purpose. I was no longer chasing anything that moved. I was choosing where to invest my time, focusing on the people who actually needed what I was offering. I began to build a routine that did not rely on luck: mornings for calls and follow-ups, afternoons for meetings, evenings for organizing notes. And preparing for the next day. It was simple, almost repetitive. But it worked, and consistency started to replace doubt in a way I had not experienced before. There were still moments when old thoughts came back, especially when I saw former coworkers posting about promotions or new positions. But those thoughts did not stay as long. They passed through instead of settling in, because I had something they did not see yet, a path that was mine, built slowly but intentionally. One of the biggest changes came when I stopped thinking about income as something that arrived randomly and started seeing it as something that followed effort over time, not immediately, not predictably every day, but reliably if I kept showing up the same way. By the 6th month, I had a small list of clients who would answer my calls without hesitation, people who trusted me enough to ask questions they would not ask anyone else, and that trust became more valuable than any single sale. It created something I had never had before in any job, a sense that I was not just filling a role, but building relationships that mattered beyond a transaction. I still drove the same truck and wore the same shirts, but I no longer felt like someone pretending to belong in this space. I felt like someone who had earned his place in it. Not through a title or a salary someone else assigned, but through the work I was willing to do when no one was watching, and that quiet confidence, the kind that does not need to prove itself out loud, was the first real sign that things were not just improving, they were changing in a way that would not easily reverse. By the end of the first year, something had changed in a way that did not need to be explained out loud. It showed up in small details that only I noticed at first. Like how I no longer hesitated before dialing a number or walking into a meeting, or how I stopped checking my phone every hour to see if something had gone wrong. The work had become part of my routine in a way that felt natural. Instead of forced, I knew what to say without thinking too much about it, and more importantly, I knew when not to say anything at all. Listening had become the most valuable part of every conversation, and people responded to that in ways I had not expected when I first started. They trusted me with details about their lives, their businesses, their worries about the future, and that trust turned into long-term relationships that extended beyond a single policy or transaction. I started receiving calls instead of only making them, referrals that came without me asking, introductions that carried weight because someone else had already spoken on my behalf, and each of those moments reinforced something I had slowly learned over months of trial and error. That consistency mattered more than talent, and patience mattered more than speed. The income followed that same pattern, not in sudden jumps, but in steady increases that built on themselves over time. I remember sitting down one evening and reviewing the numbers for the year, not with anxiety like before, but with curiosity, and realizing that I had earned more than I ever had in any previous job. It was not yet the kind of number that would impress people who measured success from the outside. But it was enough to change how I thought about what was possible. I paid off the remaining credit card balance that had followed me through the worst months. I caught up on everything that had been delayed, and for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about what I could not afford. I was thinking about what I could build next. My wife saw the difference clearly now, not just in the numbers, but in how I carried myself. There was less tension in the house, fewer quiet moments filled with unspoken concern. We started planning again in small ways, not big risks, but simple things like setting aside money for the future or talking about where we might travel someday. The kids noticed too, even if they did not say it directly. They saw that I was present in a way I had not been when everything felt uncertain, and that presence mattered more than any explanation I could give them. The second year began with a different kind of mindset, not survival but growth. I invested more time into building connections with business owners and communities that valued relationships over quick decisions. I refined my approach, focusing on clarity and honesty instead of persuasion, and that shift made my work feel aligned with something deeper than just earning a commission. It felt like I was building something that would last, something that would continue to grow even when I was not actively chasing it. There were still challenges and moments of doubt, but they no longer defined my direction. They became part of the process rather than obstacles that stopped me. And as the months passed, I realized that the version of myself who sat in that truck months earlier, refreshing job listings and hoping for a callback, would not recognize the person I had become, not because everything was perfect, but because I had stopped waiting for permission to move forward and started creating a path that was entirely my own. By the third year, the work no longer felt like something I was trying to prove. It felt like something I was building with intention. The days had structure that did not depend on motivation anymore. I knew exactly where to be, who to call, and why each conversation mattered. I had stopped thinking in terms of individual sales and started thinking in terms of systems. Simple ones at first follow. UPS scheduled without hesitation, notes organized in a way that let me remember not just names but details about people, their families, their concerns. The things they mentioned once and expected you to forget, I did not forget anymore. And that changed how people saw me. They stopped seeing me as someone who was trying to sell them something and started seeing me as someone who understood their situation. That difference was subtle, but it was everything. I began working more closely with small business groups, local trucking associations, community events where conversations happened naturally instead of being forced. I would stand there for hours, sometimes just listening, not handing out cards or pushing for meetings, just being present long enough for people to feel comfortable starting a conversation on their own. Those conversations often turned into something more later, not always immediately, but consistently over time. And consistency became the foundation of everything I did. I started to notice that my calendar was filling up weeks in advance, not with random meetings, but with people who had been referred to me by someone they trusted. That kind of introduction carried a weight I could not create on my own, and I treated it that way. Every meeting mattered. Every conversation had to reflect the trust that came with it. The income followed that same pattern of steady growth. Not dramatic spikes, but clear progress that built on itself. I reached a point where I could see the difference not just month to month, but year over year. The numbers were no longer something I avoided looking at. They became something I studied, something I learned from. I reinvested time into improving how I worked, not by adding more hours, but by making each hour more focused, more intentional. I reduced distractions, eliminated activities that did not lead anywhere, and doubled down on the ones that consistently produced results. By the end of that year, I crossed a level of income that I had once thought was out of reach. Not because it came suddenly, but because it accumulated through hundreds of small decisions made the same way every day. At home, things felt different in a way that did not need to be discussed. The tension that had once been part of every conversation was gone, replaced by a quiet stability that showed up in simple ways. Bills paid on time without concern. Plans made without hesitation. My wife and I spoke about the future with a kind of calm confidence that had not been there before. Not because we believed everything would always go right, but because we knew we could handle whatever came next. I also began to see something else more clearly. The opinions that once felt heavy, the ones that came from people who had never been in my position, no longer carried the same weight. They had not disappeared, but they no longer influenced how I moved forward. I had built something that spoke for itself, not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that was undeniable to anyone who looked closely. And for the first time, I understood that the real change was not just in what I earned. It was in how I saw myself, no longer as someone recovering from a setback, but as someone who had created a path that did not depend on anyone else defining it for me. By the fourth year, the work began to scale in a way that felt almost unfamiliar at first, not because it was sudden, but because it was layered. Everything I had built slowly over the past years started working together at the same time. Referrals came in without gaps, follow-ups turned into long-term clients, and conversations that once took weeks to develop now reached clarity in a single meeting. I was no longer chasing opportunities. They were forming around the structure I had created. I made a decision early that year to focus not just on working harder, but on building something that could extend beyond me. I began mentoring 2 new agents, not because I felt ready to teach, but because I recognized parts of my own early struggle in them: the uncertainty, the hesitation in their voice, the way they looked at rejection as something personal instead of part of the process. Guiding them forced me to become more precise in how I explained what worked, and in doing that I refined my own approach even further. I started documenting everything: patterns in conversations, common concerns across different types of clients, the timing of follow-ups, the questions that opened doors instead of closing them. It became less about effort and more about design, building a system that did not rely on guesswork. My calendar filled in a way that was no longer reactive. I could see weeks ahead clearly, meetings scheduled with purpose, time blocked for preparation instead of recovery, and that structure gave me something I had not had before: control over how I used my time. The income reflected that shift more visibly now. It crossed a level that once felt distant, not as a single milestone, but as a steady accumulation that made the number undeniable. I remember sitting in my truck one afternoon after a meeting, looking at the dashboard and thinking about the version of myself who used to sit in that same seat refreshing job listings, hoping for someone to give him a chance, and realizing that the difference was not luck or timing. It was the decision to keep moving when nothing seemed to respond at the beginning. At home, the changes became visible in ways that went beyond numbers. We replaced things we had delayed for years without hesitation, fixed what needed to be fixed, upgraded what had been put off, but more importantly, we stopped making decisions based on fear, the kind of quiet fear that limits choices without announcing itself. My wife no longer asked if this was going to work. She asked what the next step was, and that question carried a different kind of energy, one that assumed progress instead of uncertainty. Even the way my kids spoke about what I did had changed. They no longer hesitated when someone asked about my work. They answered with confidence that reflected something they had seen develop over time, not overnight success, but steady growth that was hard to ignore. I still kept the same habits that had carried me through the early days, the same discipline in how I approached each morning, because I understood now that the foundation mattered more than the results, and if I changed that foundation, everything built on it would shift too. The outside world started to notice in small ways. People who had once dismissed the work began asking questions, not directly at first, but through casual conversations that hinted at curiosity. I did not correct them or remind them of what they had said before. I simply answered the questions in the same way I always had, calmly, without needing to prove anything, because by then the work itself had already done. That the 6th year did not arrive with an announcement or a single moment that changed everything. It arrived quietly like the years before it, built on the same routines that had once felt uncertain but now felt automatic. I still woke up early, still reviewed my schedule, still approached each conversation with the same attention that had carried me through the beginning. But the scale was different now. The numbers were no longer something I had to calculate carefully. They were clear, steady, and impossible to ignore. I crossed a level of income that I had never imagined when I first sat in that folding chair learning the basics, not because I chased the number itself, but because I had built something that produced it consistently. And with that came a kind of freedom that was not loud or obvious. It showed up in how I made decisions, in how I spent my time, in how I no longer felt pressure to say yes to everything. I chose my clients more carefully, focused on relationships that aligned with the way I worked, and allowed the system I had built to continue growing without forcing it. That year we paid off the house completely. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my wife as we looked at the final statement. No celebration, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet moment where we both understood what it meant, not just financially but emotionally. The weight that had once shaped every decision was gone, replaced by something steadier. Something that did not depend on what might happen next. Thanksgiving came again that year. The same house, the same table, the same conversations that once felt heavy now felt lighter in a way I could not fully explain. My brother was there, sitting in the same place he had years before, but his tone was different now, not loud, not dismissive, just curious in a way that suggested something had shifted. He asked how things were going, not as a joke this time, but as a real question. I did not go into details. I did not list numbers or explain The path, I simply said it was going well and left it there. Later that evening, he followed me into the garage, away from the noise and the conversation, and for a moment he stood there like he was deciding what to say. Then he asked if I could help him with something. His business had been struggling, cash flow problems, decisions that had not worked out the way he expected. He did not ask directly for money at first, just advice, just a conversation. And I listened the same way I had learned to listen years earlier, without judgment, without rushing to respond. I understood something in that moment that I had not understood before, that the roles had changed without either of us announcing it. I was no longer the one trying to prove something at that table, and he was no longer the one certain of how things worked. When he finally asked if I could help him bridge a gap, I did not hesitate, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I had built enough stability to make that decision without fear. I told him I would think about it and we would talk more, and as I walked back into the house I realized that the journey had not been about changing his opinion or anyone else's. It had been about changing what I believed was possible for myself. Everything else had followed from that, quietly, steadily, without needing to announce itself to anyone at that table.